very much for joining this session of the Global Evaluation Week, which is titled Assessing the AI-Mediated Interview Quality and Evaluation. And this is a theory-grounded framework. And my name is Ali Safarnejad. And Hippolyte Lefebvre is also on the call. He's my collaborator on this, on the research that underpins this presentation. So thanks, Hippolyte, for joining as well. I think we're all here at this gLocal Evaluation Week because our intuition and our experience and our insights are telling us that evaluation practice is really entering a period of rapid and profound methodological change. And we don't want to be just watching it evolve. We want to be at the cutting edge of shaping what's to come. So my specific focus today is on one particular frontier of that change. It's where LLMs are driving a methodological shift in qualitative data collection, and specifically in interviewing and open-ended surveys. And this is an area that I'm very passionate about. And to give you some context why, I've been in evaluation and data science roles for about 25 years, working for different UN agencies. But my early roots were in computer science. And back in the late 1990s and 2000s, one of my first jobs out of engineering school was a tech startup using natural language processing to track and assess sentiments from online conversations on Usenet groups, and then using that sentiment to inform predictive analytics. So fast forward 2 decades later, and this explosion of LLMs kind of brought me back in. And for the past 2 years, I've been designing and deploying AI agents built around these commercially available, powerful LLMs to do data collection and analysis. So while developing and testing these agentic capabilities for qualitative field work, I'm also seeing the surge of new tools that are emerging to do the same and automate different elements of the research and evaluation cycle. And so a critical question popped up for me, and it's a question that frames this presentation today, is how do I know the quality of an AI-powered interview stacks up against those rigorous evaluation standards? And so to answer that question, this is how I've constructed the presentation today. So we're going through the agenda and the introduction now. Then I will frame the question I just asked about the quality of AI-powered interviews into a problem statement. And we'll look at the demands that evaluators are bound to face as the tech advances. Then to approach the problem, I'll draw from the relevant foundational evaluation theory and step-by-step show the construction of this theory-grounded framework for assessing the quality of AI-powered interviews. Then with that framework in hand, I'll move to the empirical tests, and I'll share the results of some experiments we ran to test 6 of the most widely used LLMs that were instructed to become AI-powered interviewers. And then from there, I'll present the findings of the experiments and discuss where I found the boundaries of these models' capabilities for AI interviewing. And then I'll share what I believe are some essential safeguards for deployment of those LLMs in AI-powered qualitative data collection. And then I'll open up for a Q&A and discussion, and then finally close and tell you about the upcoming sessions which are related to this. So just a few housekeeping points. My presentation is going to take about 30 minutes around that time, and then I'll open for Q&A. But because I'm doing this all by myself, so just to be respectful of your times, I've asked to keep the mics off so that I can get through it, and then we get into the Q&A. But the chat box is open, so if you feel like some question pops into your mind, just feel free to type in there, and then we'll get to it during the Q&A. All right, if that's okay, then we will go forward. So just want to drink of water. Now, as I mentioned in my intro, there's this surge of proof of concept studies using large language models as conversational interviewers. And these experiments clearly show the technical promise of AI-mediated interviewing. And from all accounts and experiences, those models talk well, they're responsive, and they hang on to your every word, and they reflect your style of speaking, and users like them. And I saw these advantages, the operational advantages, firsthand in my own field experiments with the AI interviewers in evaluation. But I also encountered some methodological risks, and I realized that to decide when and how to deploy this tech, I need more than just the ad hoc observations, which brings me to the core problem. If not already, we're going to be flooded with options of AI tools promising to do the data collection and our analysis and everything else under the sun. So each one is going to be, of course, more shinier and more fluent than the last one. But what we currently lack are the systematic criteria for judging the quality of these AI interviewers beyond their conversational performance. So as evaluators, we know that sound evaluative judgment fundamentally depends on the quality of the data. And when it comes to interviews, that means having accurate, neutral, construct-aligned, sufficiently probed data. The critical unknown right now is whether and under what conditions AI-powered interviewers actually meet these rigorous evaluation expectations. So to address this gap, together with Hippolyte, we developed a new assessment framework that draws on evaluation theory, on qualitative interviewing principles, and validity theory. We went back to the foundational literature in evaluation science, reviewing scholars like Scriven, Michael Quinn-Patton, Samuel Messick, Carol Weiss, House, Seidman, and we teased out the core requirements of rigorous inquiry. And from the literature, we established these 7 conceptual dimensions of interview quality, like construct validity, responsiveness, neutrality. Those are the round bubbles that you see on the left side of the screen around the conceptual dimensions. So I don't want to elaborate on each individual one here. They're actually detailed in our manuscript that I'll share later. But to give you some idea about it, because it's one of the core findings that's central to this research, I'll just touch briefly on two of those for illustration. One is neutrality, which is well recognized as a core criteria of scientific inquiry, and it requires evaluators to avoid introducing bias through their questions or framing or assumptions. And Robert Stake, in his 1995 book, The Art of Case Study Research, warned researchers to resist imposing external structures or predetermined categories or conceptual frames that mask what matters to the research participants. And Carol Weiss and Michael Kuhn-Patton, speaking about interviews in research and evaluation, and particularly, each of them argued that interviewers have to avoid leading questions or framing that predisposes respondents towards particular answers. And so when considering this in light of AI-mediated interviews, these principles translate to the AI agent's capacity to avoid posing those leading questions or introducing subtle bias with some suggested framing. So this is quite straightforward translation from the principle to what it means for the AI interviewer. Another one, the responsiveness dimension, was developed by Lincoln and Guba in 1981 book, Effective Evaluation. And it was, again, advanced by Stake in 1995 in his book on case studies. And the concept is grounded in contextual sensitivity and being attuned to the evaluation participants' meaning. So Patton, in his book on qualitative research and evaluation, put it into practical terms, where he advised evaluators to act as flexible and adaptable instruments who respond to the local values and emergent issues and unexpected directions, rather than sticking rigidly to the standard protocols. And Seidman extended that adaptability to interviewing, where adapting questions to the ongoing discussion is really vital to encourage respondents to shape their own account and introduce their own notion of relevance. So again, when we translate these principles to AI mediated interviewing, that responsiveness can be around instructions and training that guides the agent to recognize conversational cues and adapting question sequencing to those cues. And it's about the agent reflecting the respondent's framing and phrasing so that the questions are aligned with their perspective and their meaning. So now, armed with these conceptual dimensions, these 7 dimensions, we took the next step and translated them into an assessment framework comprising of 8 observational and observable operational measures. So those are the measures you see on the right side of the screen. 6 of these are qualitative, examining factors like whether the model maintained question accuracy and successfully avoided biased or leading phrasing. And the 2 last ones, they're quantitative, the effective quota utilization index and the additional probing rate, which captures the true depth of the inquiry. So again, these are detailed in the full manuscript that I'll share later, but just to describe 2 for illustration, question neutrality, just drawing on the dimension that I mentioned, is an easy one. It's a one-to-one mapping from the dimension to the operational measure. And in the context of AI-mediated interviews, its definition, the operational definition, is the absence of biased and suggestive or assumption-laden question phrasing. So if I find the agent reformulated my interview guide question to introduce examples or suggestive cues that could steer the interviewee to some particular answer, or if they prematurely launched some prompts that were included in the interview guide, then I would rate these down as not being able to maintain neutrality. The second one from the top, flow adaptation, was an operational measure that drew from several conceptual dimensions, including responsiveness. What it measures is how well the AI interview agent shifted the order of the interview guide to improve conversational coherence and maintain a natural interview flow rather than sticking rigidly in asking the questions in the order in which they came in the interview guide. Now, a caveat here is that flow adaptation is not the only measure that operationalizes responsiveness. Some other measures like formatting and singular questions also operationalize responsiveness. So there's a one-to-many relationship between the dimensions and the measures. Another caveat is that these measures are not exhaustive. They're representative of the set of dimensions, and they're like a tracer set of indicators that take the temperature of the quality of the interviews, but they don't completely cover all the conceptual dimensions of what a quality interview should conform to. Okay, so now moving on to the empirical test. So we're now have a framework and we're ready to test it. And we built this experiment using a convergent mixed method design to do it. So I created 2 realistic evaluation scenarios, meaning I created 2 full transcripts, questions and answers, how an ideal interview would go for 2 hypothetical evaluations. The first scenario was a strictly qualitative, semi-structured interview. The second scenario was an intra-method interview, meaning it included qualitative, open-ended questions, but also related quantitative or closed-ended questions like numerical inputs and ranking questions. And for the 2 scenarios, I used entirely simulated fictional material. And this way, I would be sure that the models that I would test wouldn't have any prior knowledge about them. They would demonstrate their genuine reasoning to formulate their questions rather than just regurgitating something they had already been trained on. I tested 6 models against these 2 scenarios. 5 are standard prompted public models that you're probably familiar with: ChatGPT, Cloud, DeepSeek. 2 flavors of Gemini, Flash and Pro, the Pro being a thinking model. And a 6th model was a custom model I created, which I fine-tuned on a corpus of training data that was curated for this particular job. And I'll say a bit more about that in the next slide, because it forms a part of the core hypothesis of this research. So on the right side of the screen, you can see a hierarchical diagram of the research design, the convergent method, 2 scenarios, and the 6 models that were tested for each. So 12 interviews in total. One other design attribute is that to isolate the AI model's performance from any human variability, in other words, to reduce any intra-rater variance, I acted as the standardized respondent. So I fed the exact same responses to every model from the benchmark interview transcripts I'd created, and only diverged if the questions that came back from the AI interviewer were significantly different. And then I scored the models on the framework that I presented before, the framework measures, and compared the benchmark or the ideal interview transcript against all the interviews that evolved in that conversation with the 6 models over the course of the 2 scenarios. Now, before turning to the results, a couple of words about that custom model, because you may be wondering, why didn't you just rely on the standard models that we most often use? So our hypothesis was that the generic prompted-only commercial models are simply too broadly trained to be effective interviewers for a specific expert work like evaluation interviews. Because the majority of the training data that public-facing LLMs have received is from things like commercial news or journalism interviews or play scripts or data center transcripts, which are foundationally different in their purpose and intent and their rigor from evaluation interviews. And second, there's a gap in research on how fine-tuning could bridge that rigor gap and improve the procedural compliance. And all the research on the use of LLMs in research interviews I found had not tested the difference between untrained and specifically trained LLMs in quality interviewing. So that, for these reasons, it was important to have a model fine-tuned specifically for this task to compare with off-the-shelf models. And to test the hypothesis, I took the base model, which is specifically was a Gemini Flash Lite model, since it's very lightweight and more likely to change its parameters with a small but targeted training set. And I fine-tuned it, which means I fed it with a highly curated data set. So about 20 multi-turn simulated interview transcripts that average around 40 questions and answers. And these were synthesized from a diversity of global evaluations, which have equal coverage in terms of region and themes and interview profile. So you can see that coverage on the top right corner of the screen where I map out, where they're coming from and what type of interviews and what themes. And then you can also see the output metrics of that fine tuning in terms of the accuracy and loss function graphs in the lower half of the screen. So these graphs basically are signaling that the training was healthy. They show that the model didn't just memorize the specific training interviews I fed it, which is called overfitting in AI training, but instead the models internalized the underlying principles of how to conduct a evaluation interview. And one important caveat here is that knowing the rules of an interview is very different from conducting one. So what I did was I taught the models the rule of the interview, and now I needed to test it to see if it could put those rules to practice in a scenario it never encountered before. And so that's exactly what my 2 simulated interview scenarios were designed to do. So let's take a look at the results of that. I summarized the findings into 4 elements here. So the first one is around fine-tuning impact. We found the fine-tuned Gemini model performed the best among the 6 models. It matched the ideal interview scenario on nearly 70% of the quality measures that we defined. So fine-tuning clearly improved the in-domain procedural compliance compared to the prompted-only base models. And practically, that means if I told the fine-tuned model and the 5 other models, please pose only singular questions. Don't bundle 2 or more questions into one utterance, which is a basic instruction you would give to an enumerator who goes out and does interviews. If I gave that instruction, the fine-tune model would strictly follow that direction. But the other models who were prompted only, not fine-tuned, they faltered from time to time and were less reliable in following the procedure. But here's the catch. So even though the fine-tuning improved following directions given to it, it didn't improve its evaluative judgment. And what do I mean by that? So for example, even though the fine-tuned model was explicitly trained on neutral interviewing, meaning to pose neutral questions, unbiased question, it occasionally struggled by asking leading questions and introducing subtle cues into the question that guided the interviewee toward a specific answer. Now, admittedly, deciding if you're asking a compound question, multiple questions in one, requires less evaluative judgment. I would say no evaluative judgment. Just count how many question marks are in your sentence, and that tells you if it's a compound question. But deciding if your question is a leading question, that requires an intelligent agent to use its evaluative judgment. It means asking itself, am I leading the interviewee if I tell them or if I ask them, how good was this program? Yes, you are leading them, so don't do it. So that's the difference between procedural compliance and that evaluative judgment. The second finding was around context dependence. We found that the performance was highly context dependent. That means the performance in one scenario may be flawless, but we can't assume out of the box with the same prompts and the same training that model will perform as well in another scenario. And recall that scenario 2 in my tests included intra-method questions that the models were not trained on or specifically instructed on. So they relied on their internal training to adjust for that scenario, and that didn't go very well. So they didn't, the context change didn't, they didn't adapt to it. On neutrality gap, I mentioned before about the fine-tuned model's inconsistent performance in neutrality. When we look closer at where all the models broke down across the board, neutrality was the most persistent failure across all of them. Maintaining neutrality turned out to be the LLM's Achilles heel. And even with explicit instructions, the models struggled with this concept. And finally, the reasoning limits. The models were actually quite good at catching overt issues. They detected and probed obviously incomplete or irrelevant responses, but they struggled with subtlety and vague formulation and quantitative logical gaps. So for example, when I introduced a fabricated and or ambiguous phrase like matchboxing or pacificity, almost all of them simply accepted that nonsense phrase without asking for clarification. And when I presented them with mathematical inconsistencies like numerators and denominators not corresponding to a proportion I fed them, only the heavier and slower thinking model, the Gemini Pro, reasoned through to catch the error and probe it further. So we've just seen how the 6 models performed against a rigorous set of methodological metrics. And we've seen that there's clear boundaries to the AI models to conduct interviews for data collection and evaluation. So at this point, you may be wondering, what are the implications of all this for evaluation practice? Do I use it or not? And if so, how do I use it? And to answer that, I want to take a step back now, because as evaluation managers, we know that methodological perfection is only one lens through which we decide on the design. When we design an evaluation, we have to also weigh the operational realities, the time, the budget, the resources, the skills, the geographic deployment of getting a team of skilled and trained enumerators into a very demanding context. So evaluation design is always a pragmatic balance between these different considerations. And with those constraints in mind, when does AI mediated interviewing actually make sense? So the intuition from these experiments and the experience says there's some few clear scenarios. First, for large scale or geographically dispersed evaluations where training hundreds of human interviewers is simply too expensive. And second, in rapid evaluations like emergency response, where timeliness is paramount and you don't have the time to bring on board a highly skilled or specialized evaluator to do a rapid assessment with a wide coverage of stakeholders. And third, for basic response validation, where we just need to make sure we don't get any empty or totally irrelevant responses. But deploying this tech also means accepting a fundamental trade-off, and that is the trade-off between efficiency and interpretive quality. Because you can instruct the model to efficiently cover a massive interview guide, or you can tune it to probe deeply. But online interviews with an AI interviewer, in my experience, will not keep the interviewee engaged as long as a human interviewer. So there'll inevitably be a struggle to balance the depth and the breadth, which is hard to train a model on that to make that trade-off. But ultimately, I don't see this decision to be a binary one. It's really about choosing human or AI-led interviews or surveys strategically. It's about matching AI interviewer deployment to specific contexts where its strengths aligns with our goals and where its limitations are acceptable risks. Sometimes that might mean a mix of two, sometimes none, and sometimes all interviews being done by the AI. All right, so this is my last slide before we go to the Q&A, but some essential safeguards in case you do decide to deploy your own agent for data collection, because we can't simply set the agent loose and walk away from it. And the prime one is the active human oversight into the data collection workflow. Tactically, that means conducting post-interview transcript reviews, specifically looking for neutrality violations. As you saw earlier, the models struggle with neutral question formulation. And so we need to look at the questions as they were posed by the agent and judge the responses in light of how neutral that question was. And second, we need strict quality assurance for any quantitative data, because the current limits in mathematical reason are restricted to the heavier models. The faster models are quite poor at mathematical reasoning. So verification of numerical responses is really essential. And third, we have to verify question type fidelity. The models, they love to spontaneously transform your questions from close-ended to open-ended or quantitative to qualitative. So the evaluation manager should ensure that that fundamental logic of the evaluation design is actually being preserved in the field. And finally, a crucial design safeguard. Good cost-effective design, in my view, starts with the evaluation manager. It's neither cost or token efficient at the moment to instruct the models to fix a poorly structured interview guide and to do that in the course of the interview. And I'll admit, I mean, there's a lot of poorly designed interview guides out there. So good design practice at the moment is to logically sequence questions up front at the time when you design your interview guide in the best order possible. So from soft questions to harder ones, or from broad to specific, from closed to more open. If the interview guide is inherently coherent, even a model that struggles to adapt dynamically during the interview will conduct a reasonably solid interview, and it will do it much more cost effectively. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the formal presentation. And I know I covered a lot of grounds today, but there's even more nuggets of knowledge if you want to dive into it. The methodology, the coding rules, the exact prompts we used in the research. So a preprint of the full research paper is currently available on SSRN, the Social Science Research Network of Elsevier. And you can scan that QR code on a screen to access it, or just drop me an email and I'll send you the link. Before I open the floor to questions, or while I do it, I also want to again pause to acknowledge my collaborator on this research, Dr. Hippolyte Lefebvre. Hippolyte, if there's anything I missed that you want to emphasize or add during the Q&A, please come online and do so. And also, I just want to give a quick reminder, because if you found today's theoretical framework interesting, tomorrow at this exact same time will be session 2, when I move into from theory to practice with a hands-on workshop where we'll actually design and set the parameters and deploy a live AI survey agent, and then take the interview ourselves and see the results. This is the same AI interviewer that I've been using in some of my evaluations. So with that teaser, let me open the floor to hear your thoughts and your pushback and your experiences and your reflections. Thank you. Oh, and please feel free to, let me also check the chat box. We're okay. Yeah, feel free to raise hands or type in a chat box if anything that you would like to bring up. Just out of curiosity, how many of you are considering AI for qualitative data collection in the next year? Okay, Miho is thinking about it. Very good. Askar, okay, very good. So a few interests, that's great. So I hope you join tomorrow so you can get a taste about how that works in practice as well. Okay, I have a question from Sonal. Thank you, Sonal. How can the model be expanded to different languages? Um, the so this is actually something I've been experimenting with, and if you join tomorrow, you can actually get a taste of it, because the model that I'm running uses several languages that I've used in my deployment. But essentially, the model that I've developed runs inside of a Google Cloud platform, so it has access to the Google services, including the translation services. So what happens behind the scenes is that as you pose a question that or give an answer to the LLM, the LLM goes back, produces its thoughts, and it feeds it to another agent, which polls the Google Translator. It translates it and then feeds it back to you. So there's a kind of a RAG model, as they call it, where one agent talks to another and it feeds the answers to you sequentially and translates to another language. So you will be able to see that in action tomorrow with several of the language that have been already prompted for. And I see another question from Askar. For analysis more than interviewing, I work in an Arabic and English environment, so I'm cautious about how AI will bring in cultural biases in interviewing, planning to use for. Yeah, so I think this is a very critical question. As I mentioned, the neutrality and the bias that comes, because these models have out of the box have been trained on a certain knowledge base. So they are not trained for evaluation context. What I did with the fine-tune model was to fine-tune it specifically for evaluation, but not evaluation in the contextual sense, but in the evaluation in the sense of how you formulate your questions to be neutral. I think what you're raising is more about the contextual knowledge of the interviewer. So one thing, and this is, really again goes back to the evaluation design, is do we want the AI interviewer to have the full knowledge of the evaluation manager? That is, do we want to feed it with all the documents, all the desk review information, so that it comes informed about the object of the evaluation? Or do we want it to come very unbiased, or let's say unprompted, to that evaluation? There's a trade-off there, both in terms of cost, but also how the evaluator will react in the context. So um, my in my practice or the evaluations that I've done both. In some cases, I've grounded it where there was a need to bring the contextual knowledge, but also being aware of the risk that you are actually bringing information. You're giving an extra power to the interviewer to inform the conversation. So it goes beyond just extracting information, but it actually brings information to the conversation as well. But then it makes the conversation more enriching. It's kind of a reciprocal giving back as well. And it also empowers it to, I mean, the reason actually we used it was also to do some fact checking. So if someone comes and says, so and so happened on this date, the emergency response took 4 weeks, it can look back at the situation analysis reports or the sit reps and say, well, actually, my information that I have shows that it took 2 weeks. So can you clarify that? So it gives it additional information that it wouldn't naturally have because it was not trained on to be able to do that. So this idea of uh, grounding the model on that information to broaden out its knowledge, but also to compensate for some of its biases can be applied also in what you're mentioning in terms of the models out of the box being trained for certain contexts, but not for others. So I hope that answers it. But it's a very interesting area of research. So if you want to explore that together at some point, we can maybe discuss some more, because that would be really something I would also be interested in experimenting with some more. Super. Okay. If no other questions, I do want to thank you all, and just to be give you back a few minutes from the session. Let me just pop this screen back up again. 1 second. Okay, do you see my screen? Okay, great. All right. So again, thank you very much for your participation, and I do hope that. Oh, is it? Okay, so just wanted to give a quick reminder about tomorrow's session. As I mentioned, there will be a session tomorrow, which is a hands-on experiment with the AI interviewer. And I also want to mention that on Thursday, I'm going to join my colleagues at UNICEF, where we experimented with this in an actual field experiment where we deployed the AI model in Maldives, using it to interview together, shoulder to shoulder with a human interviewer. So you can see how that compares, how the data quality compares, and what were some of the operational challenges and advancements that were made in that. So I hope to see you in one of those future sessions. And again, thank you so much for your time and attention and joining today, and enjoy the rest of this local evaluation week. Thank you. Goodbye.